Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the torches, grab something warm to drink, something stronger than tea if you like, and drift back to medieval Europe. We're talking about a group of people who are both fascinating and unsettling. The executioners, the ones who did the dirty work so everyone else could pretend justice was noble and orderly. The people whose names were whispered, but whose jobs everyone secretly depended on. And yet, most of the time, they weren't swinging axes. They were cooking dinner, mending clothes, playing dice, and sometimes tending to their vegetable gardens. Because, believe it or not, even executioners had domestic lives. Tonight, we'll wander through their strange world. A world where the line between shame and honor blurred, where blood paid the bills, and where your neighbors might cross the street just to avoid your shadow. So, lie back, take a deep breath, and let's float into the quiet, uncomfortable life of the medieval executioner. Off the clock. The paradox of the executioner. The first thing you have to understand is that executioners lived in a weird social limbo. They were essential, but detested. You couldn't have justice without them, but no one wanted to sit next to one at dinner. In medieval Europe, crime and punishment were public theater. Executions were as much about displaying authority as they were about ending lives. The crowd would gather. The priest would pray. The condemned would confess, sometimes dramatically. And then, when everyone had had their moral entertainment for the day, the executioner would step in to finish the job. The strange part is, for all their public work, executioners were treated like they had the plague. They were forced to live on the edges of towns, often near the gallows or outside city walls. Their houses were marked, sometimes literally, with red paint or specific symbols, as if to warn everyone else. Unclean, but necessary. Because while they were indispensable to justice, they were also seen as tainted by death, kind of like medieval garbage collectors, but with heads instead of trash. Becoming an executioner, not exactly a career dream. Most executioners didn't choose the job. It wasn't something you dreamed about as a child. No one said, "Someday I want to decapitate people for a living." Usually it was inherited, passed down through generations like an unwanted family curse. If your father was an executioner, you probably were too. It was one of those hereditary professions, right up there with millers, blacksmiths, and coffin makers. Sometimes, criminals were offered the position as a way to escape punishment. You might be sentenced to hang, only for someone to step forward and say, "Actually, we need a new hangman." If you accepted, your neck was spared, but your reputation was permanently gone. You became the person everyone needed but no one respected. Imagine the job interview. "So, we see you've got steady hands, a strong stomach, and no moral boundaries." Perfect. And because of the stigma, executioners often had trouble finding spouses. Who wants to marry the guy whose day job involves boiling traitors' heads? So they often ended up marrying within their own families, or occasionally with widows of other executioners. The result? Little dynasties of professional killers, generation after generation. Family dinners must have been interesting. Life on the edge of town now. Let's picture an average executioner's home life. It's the 15th century. You live in a small, slightly damp cottage near the city gates. Your neighbors keep their distance, but they also rely on you for practical things. Because, ironically, executioners often doubled as healers. Yes, healers. The same man who cut off thieves' hands was also trusted to fix broken bones. Because, after all, who knows anatomy better than the guy who spends his mornings dissecting people for justice? Executioners learned how to use herbs, salves, and bone-setting techniques, and people secretly came to them for medical help. It was like going to the local doctor, if your doctor also occasionally burned witches. In some towns, executioners even ran small apothecaries. They made ointments and powders from all sorts of grim ingredients, some of which they probably didn't mention too loudly. And people would sneak to their doors at night, knocking softly, hoping no one would see them asking for medicine from the hangman. But no matter how useful they were, they remained outsiders. Their children were banned from certain schools. They couldn't enter guilds or hold most civic positions. Even their animals were sometimes shunned. Executioners' dogs were thought to be cursed. It's a hard life when even your dog can't make friends. Money, blood, and side hustles. So, how much did an executioner make? Well, not a fortune, but not bad either. They were usually paid per job like freelancers. A hanging, for example, might pay a small fee. Beheading a nobleman, more. Torture sessions, burnings, and quarterings. Premium pricing. And then there were the side earnings. Executioners were allowed to keep the clothes and possessions of the condemned. If you were hanged in a nice doublet or fur-lined coat, congratulations. The hangman just got a wardrobe upgrade. Some executioners also sold the body parts of the executed for use in folk medicine. Human fat, known as poor sinner's grease, was believed to heal wounds. People even bought bits of rope from hangings, claiming it brought luck or fertility. Nothing says romantic gift like a noose fragment. So yes, it was grim. But for some, it was also profitable. The executioner as a local celebrity, sort of. Despite their pariah status, executioners were minor celebrities in their own twisted way. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone pretended to avoid them, but couldn't stop talking about them. In big cities like Paris or Nuremberg, famous executioners even had nicknames. Franz Schmidt, for instance, the Nuremberg executioner in the late 1500s, kept a meticulous diary of his work. He executed 361 people over 45 years and recorded every single one, noting their crimes, methods, and sometimes little moral reflections. When he retired, he became a respected doctor. Yes, you heard that right. He went from chopping off heads to writing prescriptions. Talk about a career pivot. In his writings, Schmidt often expressed pity for the condemned, saying he was simply carrying out justice, not enjoying it. He even described some executions as merciful because he performed them quickly and cleanly. In his mind, precision was compassion. That's what's so fascinating about these men. They were caught between cruelty and conscience. They didn't see themselves as monsters, just workers in an ugly system. And in a way, they were right. Love, marriage, and the hangman's family. Now, let's talk about romance. Or whatever passed for it in the world of executioners. Because, as you might imagine, dating was complicated. Executioners were forbidden from marrying outside their own social circle in many cities. They couldn't marry merchants, craftsmen, or guild members, which basically meant you could only marry another executioner's child, or someone just as socially outcast. As a result, executioner families often intermarried for generations. And yes, the gene pool got shallow. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a royal inbreeding problem, except with more axes and fewer crowns. Still, some families managed to rise above the stigma. Franz Schmidt's children, for example, were allowed to marry into respectable families after his retirement. By then, he had earned enough social capital to wash off the shame. Literally, as city councils sometimes issued certificates of cleansing. A nice bureaucratic way of saying, okay, you're officially not cursed anymore. What they did for fun. Yes, there was fun. So, what did executioners do when they weren't, executing? They gambled. They drank. They went to fairs, though usually stood apart from the crowd. They sometimes acted as bouncers or guards for taverns, since people figured, if anyone can handle a drunken brawl, it's the guy with experience decapitating knights. Some were surprisingly artistic. Executioners had to have steady hands, after all. So many learned fine skills like carving wood, making tools, or crafting surgical instruments. And a few even became amateur anatomists. When the church allowed it, they dissected corpses for medical students or physicians. Imagine being a doctor in training, learning anatomy from the same guy who hanged your cousin last week. Awkward, but educational. The executioner's wardrobe. One of the most famous myths about executioners is the Black Hood. You know, the classic image of a faceless man with an axe. But in reality, that's mostly a later invention, popularized by theater and paintings. In the Middle Ages, executioners usually dressed like everyone else, though often in practical, dark clothing, because, well, stains. But some cities did have ceremonial robes for official events, especially when nobles were executed. And get this, executioners sometimes wore white, not black. The idea was purity, justice served cleanly and fairly. So, if you see an old illustration of a man in white about to chop off a head, that's not a priest. It's probably the executioner, dressed for work. They might also carry a badge or symbol of office, a small sword or staff, to show they were acting under lawful authority. Without it, they could be arrested for murder. Because, as strange as it sounds, there was a fine legal line between justice and homicide. The smell of the job, there's no polite way to put this. Being an executioner smelled awful. The gallows reeked of decay. Boiling tar and burning flesh were regular workplace scents. And the tools, well, they weren't exactly sterilized. Axes, knives, saws, they were used again and again, wiped down at best. And you couldn't exactly pop into a medieval hardware store for replacements. So executioners became skilled at maintaining their own instruments, sharpening blades by candlelight, making sure the edge was clean enough for the next client. The work left its mark. Their hands were rough, stained, sometimes scarred by rope burns. Their clothes smelled of smoke and sweat. Even when they walked through town, people claimed they could feel the death clinging to them, which probably didn't make small talk any easier. A strange kind of pride. Despite the stigma, many executioners took genuine pride in their craft. They saw it as public service, maintaining order, upholding law. Some believed their job was divinely sanctioned. A few even had strange rituals before executions. Quiet prayers, little gestures of respect. They might help the condemned kneel or whisper a final word of comfort. Because if your job involves taking lives, maybe kindness was the only way to stay human. In some rare cases, the condemned thanked their executioners for a quick death. A clean swing was a sign of skill and mercy. A messy one. Well, let's just say you didn't want to be that guy. Botching an execution was humiliating. You could lose your job, or worse, face public ridicule. So yes, for many of them, precision was everything. They weren't sadists. They were craftsmen. A world of contradictions. So far, we've met the medieval executioner. Half doctor, half pariah. Respected and reviled. Living on the edge, both literally and socially. And yet, for all the horror, there's something strangely human about them. They had families, chores, and worries. They worried about paying rent, keeping warm, feeding their kids. They just also happened to decapitate people for a living. It's the ultimate contradiction of the medieval world. The person who symbolized justice was never allowed to live justly. Let's float to the next candlelit corner of their world, where we'll peek into the rituals, myths, and strange superstitions that surrounded executioners, and the ghosts that supposedly followed them home. Hey again, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've already outlasted half of medieval Europe's condemned. Kidding, mostly. We've talked about what executioners did during their off hours. Now, let's wander into what they believed, and what everyone else believed about them. Because to the medieval mind, executioners weren't just unpleasant neighbors. They were walking symbols of divine punishment, cursed by association, yet somehow protected by that same divine power. It was a paradox so strong you could practically smell the incense and superstition in the air. Let's start with the curses. Because of course there were curses. The hangman's curse. You might think being an executioner already carried enough bad luck. But in medieval folklore, it got worse. People believed executioners absorbed the spiritual corruption of those they killed. Every time they swung the axe or pulled the rope, a little bit of sin rubbed off. By the time they were middle-aged, they were considered spiritually radioactive. There are stories from Germany, France, and Bohemia of villagers refusing to touch an executioner's shadow. Literally, they thought that even stepping into it could bring sickness or misfortune, and if an executioner touched your belongings, especially your food, well, that was it. You'd throw it out. Bread, cheese, even wine. Apparently, sin was contagious through charcuterie. But here's the irony. That same cursed energy was also considered powerful. Executioners were feared, yes, but also sought out for charms and blessings, usually in secret. Of course, people would sneak to their door at midnight, whispering through the shutters, asking for amulets against evil or for luck and gambling. Because if you're cursed, you might as well share the wealth. Some even paid executioners to touch their children's necks, lightly, symbolically, to protect them from illness or choking, which is bold given the man's usual context for neck touching. Tools of the trade and their magic. Executioners' tools were thought to hold magical power too. The rope from a hanging was prized as a lucky charm, especially among gamblers and soldiers. People believed it could protect you from injury or even help you win in battle. Merchants sold tiny pieces of genuine hanging rope at markets. And yes, there were counterfeits. Medieval Etsy was thriving. The axe or sword used in a noble beheading might be kept as a relic. Not a holy relic exactly, but something between artifact and talisman. Touching it could supposedly cure epilepsy, headaches, or evil humors. And then there was the blood. Executioners sometimes sold the blood of the executed as medicine. Fresh blood was thought to cure certain diseases, especially epilepsy. Crowds would gather after executions, dipping rags into the puddles beneath the scaffold. A little grim, but hey, it was cheaper than a doctor. In some cities, executioners even collected and bottled it, selling it quietly to apothecaries. Business was brisk. It turns out human suffering had quite the market value. The ghosts that followed. Every profession has its occupational hazards. For executioners, ghosts were one of them. Many believed the spirits of the condemned haunted their killers. They'd whisper through the rafters, appear in dreams, or knock things over in the night. You couldn't exactly take out a medieval restraining order against a ghost, so executioners developed little rituals to protect themselves. Some carried sprigs of rosemary, or wore tiny crosses under their sleeves. Others sprinkled holy water on their weapons before each job, and some simply drank a lot, which to be fair is also a kind of coping mechanism. There's a story from 14th century Nuremberg about an executioner who claimed to see every man he'd ever killed sitting around his table at night, silent, staring. He started leaving out food for them, bread, wine, bits of meat, until the day he died. Then the town claimed he joined the feast, probably just a legend. But in a world that saw omens in everything, from comets to crooked teeth, it fit the mood perfectly. The church's uneasy relationship. The medieval church had a complicated relationship with executioners. They officially endorsed executions as divine justice, but they didn't want the hangman anywhere near holy ground. Executioners were often barred from taking communion, except at Easter. And even then, they stood at the back. Their children were sometimes refused baptism in the main church font, using a separate bowl instead. It's the medieval equivalent of being told, "We like what you do, but please don't sit at our table." Priests would occasionally perform cleansing rites over executioners after major jobs, sprinkling holy water as if to rinse off the sin of duty, which honestly sounds exhausting. And yet, when a major heretic or witch needed to be executed, the church suddenly became very friendly again. "Ah yes, Brother Hangman, our old friend. We're so glad you're available." It was a kind of moral outsourcing. Let the executioner do the dirty work, and everyone else could stay pure. Very convenient theology. Children of the axe executioner's children had it rough. They inherited both the stigma and often the family business. Towns refused to let them enter guilds, so most couldn't become bakers, weavers, or smiths. Some cities went as far as marking their birth records with a special note, literally branding them as hangman's sons or daughters. So they stayed within their own kind. Executioner families often formed their own small communities, intermarrying and supporting each other across generations. They even held annual gatherings. Grim little picnics, perhaps, but tight-knit ones. Interestingly, some children of executioners were sought out as midwives or healers. The logic went that since their family knew death, they also understood how to keep it away, which is both poetic and deeply unsettling. There are records of executioners' daughters being paid handsomely to assist in births, especially difficult ones. Because if anyone knows how to handle blood, it's them. The hangman's house, you could often spot the executioner's house by its location, outside the city walls, near the gallows or the river. And usually it wasn't in bad shape. Executioners were often given free lodging, good pay, and sometimes even land. Inside, things were surprisingly domestic. Contemporary descriptions mention tidy kitchens, well-tended gardens, even little workshops for metal tools and herbal concoctions. If you ignored the occasional set of shackles or a suspicious-looking sword on the table, it was all very ordinary. But one thing stood out. Executioners tended to keep a lot of animals. Dogs, cats, goats, chickens. Maybe for company, maybe because the locals wouldn't trade with them. Animals didn't care about stigma. After all, one 16th century Parisian executioner, Charles Sanson, was said to have kept a pet crow that mimicked the sound of his hammer striking wood. Charming. And slightly disturbing. The executioner's garden. Let's step outside for a moment, into the garden. Executioners' gardens were famous, in a quiet, unsettling way. People whispered that they grew herbs that could heal, or kill. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake, the usual suspects, but also mint, sage, lavender, because even executioners liked things to smell nice. They were known to cultivate plants used in both medicine and witchcraft. It's not hard to see how those reputations got mixed up. A few plants in the wrong jar, and suddenly your healing balm becomes a potion. Executioners used their gardens to make ointments and tinctures sold to desperate customers. The catch: you had to go there yourself, usually after dark, so no one would see you. It's like a medieval drug deal, but with more rosemary. Reputation versus reality. The interesting thing is that most executioners probably weren't as grim as their reputations suggested. Diaries and letters show that many saw themselves as civic servants, even moral men. Franz Schmidt, our old friend from Nuremberg, wrote that he prayed before every execution and fasted afterward. He described feeling sorrow for his victims, especially the young ones. When he retired, the city granted him a pension and full citizenship rights, a huge honor. He spent his final years tending to patients and writing about the art of medicine. Apparently, after decades of ending lives, he decided to start saving them. A nice symmetry if you like poetic justice. Myths and legends, executioners crept into folklore too. Half villain, half reluctant hero. Ballads and stories painted them as mysterious figures who spoke with ghosts, bargained with demons, or saw omens in the sky. In one French tale, a hangman refuses to execute a saintly man, and when forced to do so, the rope turns to silk. In another, an executioner's tears cause flowers to grow where a head once fell. Poets loved this stuff. The hangman as tragic philosopher, doomed to carry sin so others could live cleanly. It's the medieval version of the tortured anti-hero, and maybe that's not entirely wrong. In a world obsessed with sin, purity, and salvation, someone had to handle the dirty work. And they did it with grim efficiency, and occasionally, a bit of compassion. The hangman's end executioners rarely died peacefully. Many were eventually pushed out, replaced, or forgotten. Their names faded from records, their graves left unmarked. Sometimes, though, towns honored them posthumously, especially if they'd served faithfully for decades. A few even had street names or taverns named after them, but most simply vanished into history, remembered only in whispers. Still, their presence lingered. Every gallows, every scaffold, every quiet square where justice was once served, they left traces there. Maybe not ghosts in the literal sense, but echoes. Echoes of hands that did what no one else wanted to do. Welcome back, Night Wanderer. If you're still with me, lights dim, brain halfway in dreamland, then congratulations. You're officially spending your evening thinking about the social mobility of medieval hangmen. And really, what could be more soothing than that? Tonight we're gliding into the era when some executioners got famous, or as famous as a man with a bloody job could get. Because even in a world that shunned them, a few managed to climb up from the gallows to something like respectability. It's a strange story. Part horror, part civic pride, part family business empire. Let's start with a man who quite literally wrote himself into history. Franz Schmidt. The gentleman executioner. If medieval Europe had celebrity executioners, Franz Schmidt was their poster boy. He was born in 1555 in Hof, Germany. The son of an executioner, naturally. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, didn't choose the job. He was forced into it after accidentally being implicated in a crime. And as we've learned, once you wore the hangman's rope, your kids wore it too. So, young Franz inherited not just the family tools, but the family stigma. And yet, he handled it like a professional. He trained meticulously, studied anatomy, and kept immaculate records. He approached execution the way a modern surgeon approaches heart surgery. Calm, methodical, almost gentle. Between 1573 and 1617, he executed 394 people and flogged about 350 others. And he wrote down every single one. Dates, names, crimes, methods, little details about how it went. Sometimes he added reflections, short, stoic lines like, "He confessed willingly. Died well. It's chilling and strangely moving at the same time." Franz wasn't a sadist. He saw himself as an agent of justice, not cruelty. He believed a clean, fast death was a form of mercy, a way to restore balance. You almost forget that his mercy involved decapitation. In time, he became something of a civic figure. People came to him for medical advice. Broken bones, abscesses, even childbirth problems. He had the kind of practical knowledge most physicians lacked. After all, he knew exactly what was under the skin. When he retired, the city of Nuremberg did something unprecedented. They pardoned him, restored his citizenship. He became Master Franz Schmidt, a respected man. His children were allowed to marry freely and hold public office. It was the medieval version of being verified on Twitter, but with a lot more decapitations. He spent his last years as a doctor, writing about anatomy and herbal remedies. He died in 1634, peacefully, surrounded by family. Not a bad ending for a man whose entire life had been about other people's endings. The Sanson dynasty, France's bloody royal line. Now let's cross the Rhine and head to France, land of wine, wigs, and aristocratic doom. If Germany had Franz Schmidt, France had the Sanson family, and they weren't just a family of executioners. They were dynasty-level professionals. 6 generations of them served as official executioners of Paris from the late 1600s all the way to the mid-1800s. That's almost 200 years of consistent employment. The first, Charles Sanson, started small, executing thieves and soldiers. His descendants rose through the ranks until one of them, Charles-Henri Sanson, became the man of the hour during the French Revolution. Yes, that's Sanson, The one who executed King Louis XVI, Charles-Henri Sanson, was oddly elegant. A soft-spoken man who wore fine coats and kept meticulous notes about his work. He performed thousands of executions, many under the new invention that made the whole process efficient: the guillotine. He personally carried out Louis XVI's execution in 1793. Witnesses said he was calm, almost sorrowful. He bowed slightly to the king before cutting the rope. Afterward, he wrote in his diary, "He was brave. The blade fell true." And just like that, centuries of monarchy ended under his hands. The revolution made him infamous, both hated and admired. He represented equality in the most literal blade-level way. He once said, "The guillotine is the great leveler. No one was above it, not even kings." Ironically, the Sanson family became celebrities. Pamphlets about their lives circulated in Paris. People whispered their names in salons. Children played with toy guillotines. Yes, that was a thing. Pretending to be Sanson. It's the strangest form of fame imaginable. Adored for your precision at killing people in the name of justice. But Charles-Henri didn't love it. He wrote that he dreamed of retiring to a quiet life in the countryside, where no steel glints in the morning sun. Instead, he died in 1806, worn out, still haunted by his role in history. His family kept the business going until 1847. 6 generations. You could say the Sansons were the royal family of execution, just with fewer jewels and more heads. Giovanni Battista Bugatti, the Pope's favorite hangman if we drift south. To Rome, we meet someone almost absurdly polite for the job. Giovanni Battista Bugatti, born in 1779. Bugatti was the official executioner for the Papal States, which sounds like a contradiction, but the Vatican, too, had its own justice system. Bugatti was known as Mastro Titta, a nickname derived from Maestro di Giustizia, Master of Justice. He served for nearly 70 years, executing 516 people, mostly by hanging or beheading. But here's the odd part. When he wasn't executing people, Bugatti made souvenirs, little painted figurines. He sold them near St. Peter's Square to tourists. Imagine buying a tiny clay shepherd from a sweet old man, then later realizing he's the Pope's executioner. Awkward. He was so mild-mannered that locals called him Il Buon Tita, good Tita. He dressed neatly, spoke softly, and was forbidden to leave his neighborhood except on official business. When he went out for an execution, he'd walk under guard through the streets of Rome, carrying his tools in a red umbrella case. It's somehow both creepy and charming. Bugatti retired in 1864 at age 85 with a pension from the Vatican. He spent his remaining years feeding pigeons and praying daily. He once said that he never judged the people he executed. That was God's work. He was merely the hand. And honestly, if there's a more chilling bedtime quote than that, I haven't found it. The executioner's brand by the 17th and 18th centuries. Executioners had become quasi-professionals. They were salaried, trained, and sometimes even respected as experts in anatomy. But no matter how well they did their jobs, they never entirely escaped the brand. There was always that look from townspeople, that whisper of contamination. Records show that in some cities, executioners had to enter taverns through separate doors. Their cups and plates were kept aside. Even prostitutes were hesitant to serve them. When the sex workers won't take your money, you know you're unpopular. And yet, in times of plague or famine, people suddenly needed them. Executioners were called upon to clear corpses, enforce quarantines, and maintain order. They were the last line between civilization and chaos, which gave them a strange kind of leverage. No one liked them. But no one could get rid of them either. The art of the swing lets slow down for a moment and appreciate the craft of it. Because yes, there was technique. A skilled executioner prided himself on speed, precision, and control. A clean beheading required knowing exactly how to hold the sword, where to strike, how to account for muscle tension. Too high and you hit bone. Too low and you leave a mess. There were manuals written about it. Literal how-to guides for decapitation. One 17th century text even included diagrams of ideal posture and grip, as if describing a golf swing. Keep your shoulders relaxed, breathe evenly, execute in one stroke. And when it came to hangings, there was math. The drop length had to be just right. Too short and the person suffocated. Too long and, well, things went badly. Executioners studied physics before physics was cool. The best were revered for their skill. The worst were booed, jeered, sometimes even attacked by mobs if they botched it. Because apparently the crowd expected a performance. You could say they were early reality show contestants, except the stakes were a bit higher. The public spectacle executions were public for most of medieval and early modern history. They were moral theater, lessons in obedience, and the executioner was both actor and stage manager. In London, hangings at Tyburn drew thousands. In Paris, people brought picnic baskets. Children sat on rooftops for a better view. It was part horror, part carnival. The executioner had to manage timing, audience expectation, and decency, while also, killing someone. Talk about multitasking. Some executioners even developed stage personas. They wore plumed hats, fine coats, or carried ceremonial swords. They turned punishment into ritual, something almost sacred in its precision. And when the show was over, they cleaned up, went home, and made stew for dinner. Because at the end of the day, even celebrity executioners still had to eat. The slow decline. By the 19th century, attitudes toward executioners, and executions themselves, began to shift. Public hangings were banned. Justice moved indoors, away from the gawking crowds. The executioner lost his stage. In some countries, the role became almost bureaucratic, a civil servant with a paycheck, no longer a feared figure. But that also meant no status. By the early 1900s, many were struggling. The job wasn't hereditary anymore. It was just a grim trade for those who needed work. And with the rise of modern prisons and abolition movements, even that work began to vanish. By the mid-20th century, the celebrity executioner was extinct. The hangman faded from public life, leaving behind only stories, legends, and uncomfortable metaphors about justice. Fame without glory. The men who became famous for taking lives never really won. Franz Schmidt tried to redeem his family. The Sansons wanted to escape their reputation. Mastro Tita wanted peace and pigeons. They all lived in the shadow of their work. They were known but never loved. Necessary, but never celebrated. History remembers their precision, their diaries, their grim professionalism, but not their loneliness. Not the way people crossed the street when they walked by. It's the paradox that never quite resolves. You can be famous for doing what everyone despises, and still die wondering if anyone ever truly saw you. Welcome back, Traveler of Shadows. If you've made it this far, you've already walked through the gallows and stood beside the scaffold. You've seen the executioner's blade flash in sunlight and watched the crowd cheer, then scatter. But what happened after the crowd went home? When the square was empty? When the ropes hung still? That's when the human part of the story begins, the part history books rarely whisper about. Because behind every hood, there was a person who had to go home, wash their hands, and try to be human again. This is the tale of how executioners loved, married, and raised children in a world that feared their very touch. The burden of the bloodline? Imagine being born into a job that stains your name before you even take your first breath. That was the fate of most executioners' children. From the 13th century onward, the role was hereditary in much of Europe. If your father was the hangman, congratulations, so were you. No guild would take you. No noble would hire you. No priest would baptize you without hesitation. Your surname became a curse. In German towns, families like Schmidt, Reindl, and Geyers were known as Henkerfamilien, hangman clans. In France, the Sansons were whispered about for generations. Even centuries later, their descendants struggled to marry into respectable circles. The stain was social, not physical, but it felt like blood that wouldn't wash off. Children of executioners often went to separate schools or were taught at home. Other kids wouldn't play with them. There are accounts of towns where the hangman's family had to draw water from a different well, their touch considered unclean. And yet, within those small circles of exile, they built their own quiet worlds. Executioners' families often intermarried, generation after generation, forming what one historian called a closed caste of the damned. It sounds grim, but there was also tenderness in it. They loved one another fiercely, precisely because the outside world would not. The hangman's wife, few historical figures are more invisible than the executioner's wife. She rarely appears in records, yet she was essential, the other half of a condemned profession. In many cities, she was responsible for washing the condemned before execution, mending the hangman's clothes, preparing herbal salves for wounds, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, consoling prisoners before they died. In some German towns, the hangman's wife was also the midwife for prostitutes and criminals. Since respectable women refused to touch them, it was an odd symmetry. She helped bring life into the world, while her husband took it out. One 16th century record from Augsburg mentions a hangman's wife named Greta, who secretly baptized the condemned before their deaths, whispering prayers no priest would say for them. The church denounced her as presumptuous, but people in the poorer districts called her Saint Greta of the Scaffold. The world never wrote her story, but her kind must have existed everywhere. Love in the shadow of death. Do you fall in love when your hands are branded by death? The question haunted generations of executioners. Most could only marry within their kind, the daughters of other hangmen, tanners, or gravediggers. These families lived together on the outskirts of towns, near gallows fields or plague pits. In those lonely places, bonds formed easily. Imagine a quiet night after an execution. The smell of iron still faint in the air. A man scrubs his tools in a wooden trough. A woman lights a candle in the window and hums softly. He looks up and sees her face in the flickering light. Tired, gentle, knowing exactly what he's done and not flinching from it. That was love, in its purest medieval form. Many of these marriages were steady, even tender. Executioners' diaries, especially Franz Schmidt's, hint at affection and domestic peace. Schmidt wrote of his wife, Margarita, "She tends me when my dreams turn restless. Her hands calm mine." He never said more. He didn't need to. It was enough. Children of the rope. The children of executioners had strange in-between lives. They were feared by townsfolk, yet they often grew up healthy, educated, and self-sufficient. Many became apothecaries, barbers, or bone setters, jobs that required anatomical skill without the social weight of killing. In fact, some of Europe's early surgeons came from executioner families. They already knew the human body better than most doctors. But there was always the shadow of inheritance. If a son refused the profession, he risked poverty, and sometimes exile. Some fled cities under false names, marrying into distant towns where no one knew their past. It was rare, but a few broke the cycle completely. A 17th century record from Würzburg tells of one such man, Matthias Reindl. He left his father's post as executioner, joined a monastery, and became a monk. When his background was discovered, he was almost expelled. But the abbot reportedly said, "The hangman's son now saves souls instead of taking them. Let him stay." And so he did. The hangman's house. Every European city once had a place called Galgenhaus, the hangman's house. It stood on the edge of town, near the execution site, surrounded by fields or forests. These houses were both homes and workshops. Inside, you'd find tools of death, ropes, blades, branding irons, heavy gloves. But you'd also find drying herbs, jars of salves, and books of remedies. The same man who executed in the morning might set a broken leg in the afternoon. The walls often bore religious symbols, crucifixes, paintings of saints, or verses like, "God judges all, I am but his hand." Visitors described them as strangely peaceful places, quiet, neat, smelling of wax and herbs. It was as if the executioner tried to build a small island of order against the chaos of his profession. Sometimes they had gardens, roses, lavender, thyme, because no matter how much blood touched their lives, they still wanted beauty nearby. The hangman as healer, it sounds absurd, doesn't it? That the same man who killed could also heal? And yet, that's exactly what many executioners became. Their deep knowledge of anatomy, coupled with herbal medicine, made them surprisingly skilled at treating wounds and illnesses. Franz Schmidt treated over 15,000 patients after his retirement, mostly poor citizens who couldn't afford physicians. People lined up at his door. He reset bones, drained abscesses, treated infections, and dispensed herbal tonics. Some said his touch was cursed. Others swore it was blessed. In France, the Sansons also practiced medicine. Charles Henri reportedly performed small surgeries in his later years, calling them acts of balance. It's poetic in a way. The executioner's redemption came not through prayer, but through healing, by using the same hands that once ended lives to mend them. Faith and forgiveness religion was a constant presence in the executioner's world. They worked for both the state and the church, killing in the name of justice, yet forever considered sinners. It was a contradiction they never fully escaped. Many executioners attended mass secretly, or sat in the back pews, unacknowledged. Some built private chapels in their homes. One 15th century hangman in Prague carved a crucifix from the wood of a gallows beam. He prayed to it every night before bed. Their faith wasn't public or performative. It was desperate, intimate, a way to keep their souls from drowning in the weight of their duty. One anonymous diary, found in Vienna in the 1700s, ends with this line: "God forgive me for the faces I cannot forget." No signature, just the quiet hope that forgiveness, somewhere, might reach even the executioner. The last generation, by the 1800s, The executioners' families were fading. Public executions were abolished. Science replaced superstition. The hangman's house fell silent. In 1847, when the last Sanson laid down his sword in Paris, he wrote a short note. "Our family has served death long enough. Let others serve mercy now." It was the end of an era, not just for his bloodline, but for an entire way of life. The hangman's children scattered into modernity, taking new names, becoming doctors, teachers, citizens. No one remembered who their grandfathers had been, and maybe that was the greatest mercy of all. Epilogue. The Quiet Redemption. The executioner is one of history's strangest figures. Neither hero nor villain. A man who lived by society's rules, yet was cast out for enforcing them. In the end, his story isn't about cruelty. It's about endurance. About finding meaning in the darkest of professions. When we peel back the myths, we don't find monsters. We find tired men and women doing their duty, longing for peace. Franz Schmidt with his healing hands. Margaretha Schmidt praying over her sleeping husband. Mastro Tita, painting small figurines while pigeons gathered at his feet. They remind us of something timeless. Even in the bloodiest corners of history, humanity refuses to die. And perhaps that's what redemption really means. Not to erase the darkness, but to build a little light within it. Hey again, if you're still with me at this point, you're officially deep in the quiet end of history. The part most people skip over because it's not flashy, not grand, and not filled with battles or kings. Just people, ordinary people with extraordinary burdens. And among them, the medieval executioner stands apart. A man who saw more death than a soldier, but carried none of the glory. A man who could never forget a face, even if the rest of the world forgot the name. So tonight, we're going to sit with him a little longer, in his silence, in his sleeplessness, and maybe, just maybe, in his strange kind of peace. The night after, it's easy to imagine the moment of execution. The crowd, the drums, the sharp breath of the condemned. But what about the night after? That's where the records grow quiet. But the silences, if you listen closely, tell you everything. Executioners often described sleepless nights, trembling hands, or the feeling of being unclean, no matter how often they washed. They developed rituals, small acts of control. Some would scrub their tools in vinegar and salt, almost obsessively. Others would fast for days, or spend hours in prayer. One Nuremberg hangman reportedly slept with a Bible under his pillow to keep away dreams. Franz Schmidt, our calm, methodical friend, once wrote after a double beheading, "I did my duty, but the faces return when I close my eyes. They are not angry. They only look at me." He never stopped seeing them. The faces. There's something almost unbearable about the intimacy of execution. It's not like battle. You're not fighting an enemy. You're looking into the eyes of a single person whose fate you control entirely. And that moment stays. Even the most professional hangman admitted to remembering particular faces. A young thief who cried for his mother. A woman who refused to kneel. A noble who whispered a prayer with such calm that it unsettled everyone. Schmidt recorded their names, crimes, and final words in precise, tidy handwriting. Like he was keeping their humanity alive through record-keeping. It's strangely touching, really. He didn't want them to vanish into rumor. He wanted them seen. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe, after years of taking lives, he simply understood how fragile they were. Coping in a world without therapy, medieval people didn't have therapists. No one sat you down and said, "Let's unpack that trauma." You had prayer, fasting, and ale. That was about it. So executioners found their own ways to cope. Some turned to faith. Others turned to craftsmanship. Carving wood, painting, writing. The act of creation, even in small forms, helped balance the destruction. Franz Schmidt collected herbs. Mastro Tita painted toy soldiers. In England, one executioner became a clockmaker, saying he preferred to watch time move forward instead of end. That line feels like something you'd read in a melancholy novel. But he actually said it. A man who had once ended hundreds of lives, now choosing to count the seconds they'd never see. The dreamscapes of the condemned. We'll never really know how executioners dreamed, but the few who wrote about it gave us glimpses. Quiet and unsettling. A 16th century hangman in Strasbourg claimed that he dreamed of ropes twisting themselves into faces. A French one described rows of heads whispering prayers in his sleep. Franz Schmidt wrote rather flatly, "I dream sometimes that they all stand waiting, not for revenge, only for my company. It's not frightening. It's sad, like the condemned still lingered somewhere. quietly keeping him accountable. And maybe that's why he spent the rest of his life healing people, to balance the scales, one wound at a time. The town that looked away. Despite how much society needed executioners, people didn't really see them. They crossed the street to avoid them. They averted their eyes during Mass. They whispered about them behind closed doors. The hangman's at the market. Don't let him touch the bread. It's human nature, isn't it? We love justice, but not the person who delivers it. We want punishment, but not the punisher. The executioner was the scapegoat who carried everyone's sin, not symbolically, but literally. He was the man who did what others wanted done, then paid the moral bill for it. Every single time. It's no wonder some of them lost themselves in silence or drink. It's no wonder others became philosophers of the macabre. If you stare into mortality that long, eventually you start thinking about it too much. The guilt that didn't go away. There's a peculiar entry in Schmidt's later writings, one that always catches historians off guard. He wrote, "Some I pitied, some I judged. Some I envied. That's the strange part. What could an executioner possibly envy in a condemned man? Maybe peace, maybe closure, maybe the simple privilege of being done with it all." Executioners carried guilt not because they doubted justice, but because they never got to leave it behind. Every death stayed, every crime replayed in memory. Their lives were long confessions with no priest to absolve them. Death of the hangman. Ironically, most executioners were buried quietly, often without a priest. The same church that used them in life wanted nothing to do with them in death. They were interred on unconsecrated ground, outside city walls, under simple stones. No epitaphs, no blessings. But a few broke the rule. When Franz Schmidt died in 1634, the city of Nuremberg buried him in consecrated soil. They even inscribed his tomb with the words, "A faithful servant of justice." It was the closest thing he'd ever get to forgiveness. And in Paris, when Charles-Henri Sanson died after years of public executions, his son wrote simply, "He served his office with regret and left this world quietly." Quietly. The perfect word for a man whose life was defined by noise, drums, shouts, steel, and who finally, mercifully, found silence. The legacy of the unseen modern historians often describe executioners as necessary evils. But that phrase feels too neat, too clinical. They were something else entirely. They were mirrors, reflecting the dark fascination humans have with justice, cruelty, and the strange theater of punishment. Every society, no matter how civilized, builds a place for the executioner. And every society then pretends not to see him. The gallows might be gone now, the scaffold dismantled, the sword rusted, but that uneasy paradox still lingers in us. We still want justice. We still fear the people who deliver it. And somewhere, in a metaphorical sense, the hangman's shadow still stretches across the town square. A quiet candle at the end, so. Let's end where all medieval nights ended, with a candle burning low. Picture a small house outside the walls. Inside, an old man sits by a table. His tools are gone now. His hands tremble from age, not guilt. He sips wine, writes a few final words, then leans back, listening to the wind through the garden herbs. He has lived between life and death all his days. He has served kings, churches, and towns that would never dine with him. And yet, he has survived them all. In his final hour, perhaps he finally feels what none of his condemned ever did. The slow, gentle approach of peace. And as the candlelight fades, we leave him there. Not as a monster, not as a saint, but simply as a man who bore history's heaviest job, and somehow, through the centuries, remained heartbreakingly human.